Welcome to the Upwards podcast, where we discuss the intersection of Christian faith in the academy, church, and marketplace to illuminate the good work happening with individuals, institutions, and in our communities. My name is Daniel Johnson, and I'm your host for today's conversation. My guest today is Angie Ward. She's the director of the Doctorate of Ministry program and associate professor of leadership and ministry at Denver Seminary. Her new book, Beyond Church and Parachurch, From Competition to Missional Extension, is out now on InterVarsity Press. Angie has over 35 years of ministry experience in the church, nonprofit, and higher education. Please subscribe, like, and hit the bell to be notified when a new episode of the Upwards podcast is released. You can download the episode in your favorite podcast app and click the link in the description below or search for the Upwards podcast. The podcast notes for today's conversation include a link to view this episode on YouTube for your convenience. Please remember to follow and subscribe to stay updated with our latest episodes in your podcast app. The podcast notes for today's conversation include a link to view this episode on YouTube for your convenience. Remember to follow or subscribe to stay updated with your latest episodes in your favorite podcast app. If you appreciate conversations like this, we encourage you to attend an event at Upper House in person. You can see our full list of our schedule on our website at slbf.org. I have today with us Angie Ward. Angie has a brand new book out that I just finished reading, and it is excellent. It's called Beyond Church and Parachurch, From Competition to Missional Extension. It's a great book, Angie. So excited to have you on the podcast. So excited to have this conversation. This is in the wheelhouse of Upper House and exactly what we do in our organizational life here. And we are kind of this intersection between church and parachurch and mission to the campus. And so all of the information in this book was so good. And I'm excited to share that, not with only our community, but with other folks that tune in and are here with us. So Angie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's so good to be here with you. I'm coming from Denver and you're in Madison, my home state.
That's great. Well, tell us a little bit about your vision. I know in the book you talk a little bit about why you wrote the book, but give us a little insight about kind of how the book came forth. What were you experiencing when you decided to kind of launch into this project?
Yeah, well, the book is really a result of kind of a 7, 8, 9-year journey of me being in ministry, having grown up in the church, being in vocational ministry, church, and kind of all sorts of different organizations, academic, parachurch, Christian nonprofit type stuff like that. But then also teaching ministry leaders and leadership. And so I had this aha moment about maybe now it's probably 7 or 8 years ago where I was teaching a ministry leadership class at a different graduate school class. And so I'm teaching this stuff and it's like, church and ministry and leadership the way I'd kind of experienced it and been taught it. And that was kind of during the very leadership heavy John Maxwell, Bill Hybels kind of stuff. And I was like, I had the stop cold moment in the middle of my class and so I'm in kind of this U-shaped classroom. And I thought for a moment, like I'm teaching this ministry leadership stuff and to a certain model. And I don't know how we got to this model or if I even buy this model, which was very disconcerting because it's like, that's kind of what my PhD was in. That's what my career was becoming at that point. And furthermore, I thought, okay, I have ministry and leadership degrees and all this experience from a Christian college, from Denver Seminary, from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, got a PhD in ministry leadership. And I know more about leadership than I do about the church. And God's design for the church, not the organizational components of it, but and so I thought, and if I'm teaching this, that's a problem. And I've had my lifetime in the church, and I don't even know what the church is supposed to be and do. And so that led me on this journey that really has culminated in this book of going what is the church? What is the church supposed to be and do? Who is the church? What is, the church parachurch, this term, or Christian nonprofit? How do they all fit together in this whole concept of church? And we can talk about different definitions, over the conversation. But, and so it started kind of with and I kind of went, okay, let's just, deconstruct from the ground up. Like, what is a church? Not just taking what is the structure that I've known as church or this institution that we've experienced as church, but like, how did it start and what is it rooted in and all that? And started reading some church history. I just kind of nerded out a little bit, started just, I don't know, reading with fresh eyes, I think, instead of like how to lead within or all that kind of stuff. And and then started creating a class at Denver Seminary before I was actually moved out here. That was a doctoral course called Reclaiming Ecclesiology. So ecclesiology being this, $10 seminary term about what the church is supposed to be and do, kind of doctrine of the church or understanding of the church, theology of the church. And it became like one of our most popular courses, and it resonated with people, and other people were asking these questions and saying, man, asking these things and exploring these same things is really like changing my ministry, changing in some ways kind of life trajectory. So I just found a lot more people who were asking these same things, having these conversations. And then we had the pandemic hit, transformed, it kind of accelerated all the things that we were seeing before, kind of decline of trust in institutions, trust in leadership, religiosity, church going, all these kind of things. And so even more people started asking these questions and saying like, well, if we can't go back or we're, kind of rebuilding some things from maybe some rubble, what is that going to look like? So it really is my outworking of all the questions I've had.
Yeah. No, that's good.
And trying to go, is there a different way?
Yeah. No, that's great. You spend a lot of time at the beginning kind of talking through the history, which I think is really important. We really value that here. We have a few historians on our team here.
That's great.
And so talk to us a little bit about kind of the church, parachurch. I know that we're going to talk about maybe your vision for a different term later on around what parachurch should be, maybe even titled. But give us a little bit of a history lesson, maybe if you would, around kind of the two identities and where did they kind of blossom out of as you look at this landscape of the history here.
Yeah. First, I mean, and you're right. There's like church and parachurch are these loaded terms. Like in the book I talk about, I think there's maybe a dozen ways we use the term church. And so for this, I'll talk about church as kind of like what we think of like a local congregation that maybe likely meets in a building, kind of thing, which is kind of the historical for thousands of years, or I mean, 100 decades, I mean, centuries at least, kind of since kind of the church became more as part of the establishment post Constantine, so this cultural, organizational understanding of it. And then there's this thing called parachurch, which some people don't know what that means, but I use it kind of like Christian ministries that aren't the church. I mean, like in this way that I just talked about. So, InterVarsity, Upper House, all these different, campus ministries, certainly Christian radio, Christian publishers, Compassion International, all these kind of things. So these like, mission driven Christian nonprofit generally, not always, but, so they have some sort of work adjacent to kind of local congregation or in partnership with kind of thing. Well, so I started going like this idea of parachurch, where did this come from? And I thought it was maybe like from the 50s or something. Like I worked at a Christian camp that started in the late 1940s. It was like started by Awana missionaries. All these, there are a lot of different organizations that sprang up kind of 40s, 50s. Then I started going back and going, wow, there's actually this history of stuff, kind of second grade awakening in England, even before that, these voluntary societies of trying to like social ills in society, stuff like that. But then I went back even further and realized that like this idea of the parachurch is actually what monasteries were doing. Like we think of monasteries, and some of them are cloistered and like separate from everyone, but really going way back into like early church history, like 400, 500 years after Christ, there these believers were feeling like the church structure was too rigid, or was becoming that, and there were these kind of apostolic missional extension, extensions being out there. And so there's this long history of involving lay people and also having tension with who's in charge, and who owns the resources. It wasn't till around, you have to check my church history. Let your historians figure that out. But, 1200, 1300, where like the Pope started saying, hey, we have to take these things under our wing and start sanctioning them, because it was like you had these priests, but then you had these monastic kind of things, and they're doing ministry in the community, but the church was the place where you had the sacraments, all that kind of thing. So I just realized there's this long history of people doing the work of ministry outside of or aside or next to, but not always under a local church.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think I would love for you to maybe give us a couple terms. I think that would maybe help guide the rest of our conversation.
Yeah.
You outlined the church in a lot of different, definitions people have. You just talked about the local church.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people think about. You also talk a little bit about what we call kind of like the big C church dynamic of things.
Yep. Yeah.
Maybe what would be kind of your best kind of working definition of church right now as kind of you see our current kind of landscape? How should kind of Christians, how should we kind of maybe think about what that term means and maybe reframe our view of it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, I mean, when I started looking at scripture and the term kind of the gathering or ecclesia, and so it's like, I have a definition. I'll read it to you from the book and real quick.
Great.
So, I mean, I unpack it more in the book, but I'm like, this is my best attempt thus far after wrestling with it. And I make my students do this too,
Sure.
So the church, and I'd say biblical ecclesia, is divinely established, called out, and sent collection of all the people of God around the world. So there's this big C, universal, global, animated, united by the work of Christ and guided by the Holy Spirit, who gather regularly in locally embodied community to recenter their lives around God and who seek to live out kingdom values in their relationships with one another and with the world. So there is this idea of this global big C, capital C church. But like you read the New Testament, the early church fathers, there's not this idea of you could only be part of that and not be part of a local gathering. And that's where the formation and discipleship happened in those relationships, not as a separate outsourced collection of spiritual services that we kind of can see today. You could get your Christian radio. You could go to, BSF or Friendship Bible Coffee. I'm not trying to pick on those organizations. I'm just saying, your kids could be part of FCA and do see at the pole and, and you can be part of this church for this thing, but your kids go to the youth group at this thing and this thing at, and we've kind of pieced out this idea of this gathered body in this community. So I think it's become, I'd say for a while there was this idea of, well, you have to be part of the local church, and some people would say all ministry has to come out of the local church. Like this idea of parachurch is invalid. Well, through history you see that and how the church is movemental and apostolic. It's like I don't buy that. But there's also this, I think, a swing that I've seen more today, which is people having had bad experiences with the local gathering or poor leadership or spiritual abuse, legitimate wounding and hurt, but they go, I'm going to do away with that. I'm just part of the big C church,
right.
And so I think there is a both and to that.
Yeah. I think the embodied piece of your definition is really important. We really try to have embodied experiences within the mission of our work here. We really value that and think that's really important. Although we are in a very interesting time where we have more technology and a technological shift that's happening. And so, there are people that are experiencing community or church, that don't set foot in a local embodied kind of environment. What's your kind of viewpoint on that as you think about your definition of the church? I love the embodied piece of it. And wondering how you kind of think and reconcile around those that might primarily do, religious life, spiritual formation in an online form, right? They're reading a Bible on their phone or a tablet. They're attending a church that's virtual all the time.
Yeah. I mean, and I say in the book, I say my idea of embodied, I think that's the adjective that probably gets me the most pushback from people. But so I just think that Christ's incarnation and the nature of humanity point to the significance of that embodiment, like you said. Can you do parts of it online? Yes. Can you be entirely married online? I think most of us would say, at some point there's got to be some regular, some sort of embodiment there, know, and can you consummate a marriage online? No, so it's like, so I think there is an embodied piece. Technology has made it easier to do some things, and it's certainly a gift to people who shut-ins, that type of stuff. But even then, it's like there should be visitation, embodied presence. And I think we misunderstand what for a long time, church congregations, we had this view of them as educational institutions. And so you could, if that's about content delivery or experiencing, watching someone speak or watching some, kind of thing. But I think there's something also in scripture. I think there's something spiritually. I think there's something that the early church father understood, and the New Testament writers, something different that happens when we're gathered that does in that type of, as in a divinely established intentional body that is different. The Spirit shows up in a different way. I know there's like the where two or three are gathered, there I am. Yes, all that is true. And Jesus established the church. God divinely established the church.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the educational standpoint of what the church has done for so many millennia. I think it's an interesting shift that we're in now, where a lot of the educational pieces are actually being stripped out of the church. And I think there's also a simultaneous kind of rise of, post-World War II, you saw all these parachurch ministries kind of explode as churches were kind of starting to strip out the educational component out of their, weekly kind of activity of thing. And so it became less educational, and there was a gap. And I think a lot of parachurch ministries saw the need for what could be there, from radio to TV to Bible studies to, we'll send you a thing of tapes that you can listen to in your car, and here are all the things. It's just an interesting kind of like cultural shift dynamic about what the church had done for so long.
And even their proximity, because that whole local congregation thing, it's like, as society became more mobile with the automobile and stuff, you didn't have to just live and walk to your local church. Or like Navigators, some of those ministries, college ministries are going, okay, when you're away from your church, your local congregation, you're serving overseas during a world war. It's like, well, Navigators was started out for, Navy, for seamen who needed some fellowship and discipleship. And evangelism. And so they all have started from like legitimate needs and places that the church local couldn't go or be at that time, or people were separated from that.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about parachurch. You bring up a really interesting, I think, shift about how we talk about parachurch, and especially a definition around it. I would love for you to maybe unpack that kind of new definition around parachurch, because I think it's actually really helpful for folks to kind of hear and understand. And then kind of, as you see kind of the current landscape of parachurch, let's just say in the US, because that's kind of the context that we're in.
Yeah. Well, so, I'll start out first. The problem with parachurch, first of all, if you don't have a clear definition of church, it's like, what, then which many people don't, haven't really thought about it. And, our whole identity is about Christ. And then you go para, well, what does that mean? Alongside, does that mean meant to primarily like to support the church, or out of the church, or alongside? And I think it also, we've just taken this kind of institutional structural understanding of things, organizational, and so it's like, so let's gather and organize, and that's great because we can do more together than we can go by ourselves. But in some ways, then that tends toward institutionalism. And so I think we just have come up with this very organizational framework of there's church organizations and structures and containers, and then, cylinders or silos, and then there's parachurch organizations. And so instead of viewing it as these, kind of, as our president at Denver Seminary here calls cylinders of excellence or silos, but we're viewing it as the containers, and we've got these walls, and the walls are like what our area of expertise is, and also a lot of theological boundaries and stuff. And we think about having to keep resources or gather resources for within that container. And then some people are called maybe to start or be part of a container that's doing X, Y. It's like Compassion International or campus ministry or global evangelism, missions, that type of thing. But when you look at so I'm saying, hey, let's take instead of a kind of a structural institutional approach or view, let's look at functionally, like the church is missional, meaning like the God's heart is the missio Dei, this idea of wanting to bring around the restoration, redemption, full flourishing of of all people and all things in the whole world. And so God's people and we have a gathered piece, but like each of us is supposed to be missional, on mission, and then movemental, like there's an agility to it that we see in scripture in the early church that we lost when we started doing more like these kind of institutional established plant kind of things, which there's strengths and weaknesses. But so I think you're wanting the big reveal of the term that I'm suggesting is missional extensions. And by that I mean not just that parachurch are missional extensions, but really expanding that to we are all part of a global ecosystem network as believers, missional extensions, as the church, the body of Christ. So the gathered local church is a missional extension or outpost, kingdom outpost in its community. It can do what's called near neighbor missionality really well. There's other organizations that can go to the ends of the earth in places that a local church can't or necessarily shouldn't do. Local church doesn't have to become a publishing house and a global kind of thing. And then you've got these other, organizations or people. And then each of us as believers are missional extensions as well. And so you flatten that structure and view it as more of these nodes on a network that kind of cover the globe, almost like a big fishnet, with these threads in between them. And so every believer, like everyone's connected to the other. If it's a true ecosystem, when one struggles, like every change changes everything in a system.
Yeah.
And so there's more of an interdependence and a relationship and a recognition of that. And these organizations become more like lily pads to hop along instead of these kind of containers that you're trying to build and hold.
Yeah. So as we think about like the missional extension piece, where have you seen that work really well? I'm thinking about the local embodied parachurch, those two different dynamics together. Before coming to Upper House, I was on staff with a youth ministry organization for 13 years. My experience with the local embodied church was very different across the board, right? So our mission was to reach students that wouldn't set forth in a church. They wouldn't, enter into those doors. We were at the high school or the middle school, college campus all the time, face-to-face, a lot of face-to-face kind of ministry, one-on-one, small group dynamics of things. And my experience with the local church was varied, right? So there were some that saw this organization, the organization I was working for, as an extension of what they were doing and saying, we have a youth program, but the kids that you're ministering to aren't going to set forth in our church. Others were, 50-50 on it. They weren't like, hey, we're going to be your biggest cheerleader, but they weren't opposing what we were doing. And then there were organizations that didn't think that we should be around the community, to be around it, because part of it was
their job.
Seeing it as a threat, right? Why we have a youth ministry program? Our youth ministry should be doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah. So where have you seen maybe those two different types of connections actually work really well together in your history?
Yeah, well, so first I'll give you some principles, I think, of what are behind commonalities with ones that work well. So I think there's there's an open-handedness, like between the examples you gave. There's one that's more like, there's some that's like, if my net didn't catch it, it's not fish. And so I've known of like missionary organizations, global missionary, and they're in the same village, and they're not partnering with one another at all, because it's like they're trying to convert Baptist and Methodist, and it's like never the two shall meet kind of thing. Yeah. So there's an open-handedness, there's a more free-flowing, there's just, the walls aren't as high, between, and so there's a willingness to there's a kingdom-mindedness, there's I think a willingness then across, I think everything is just, more open-handed, more willing to share people resources and not view them as mine or ours to keep, and our money is not ours and mine. It's kingdom. And if it's better for us to give it to you, and which is very countercultural as far as kind of this leadership, like your job is to build up your thing and to increase your impact because that's what donors want to see, and so it's a whole shift in, mindset, and even the stories and the assumptions we tell about, or stories we tell and the assumptions behind them about what is success and what is the purpose of that. So I think some of those things. So I think, like I see what you're doing with your study center or study house, and you've got, like you're telling me, you've got a church in residence. So you've got, like, built into the, by constitution, you have to have a relationship with a local church. You have students coming in who are missional extensions to their points on campus. But you're also saying, hey, church, local congregation is important. You're not saying, so I think there's a recognition in that ecosystem of like the nodes of, the ones that are partnering, doing things well, they're recognizing we're not the only show in town. We need each other. We are committed to one another in some tangible ways, not just praying for, but and we just have this understanding of this ecosystem and of our role in it and what we can't do, what we don't need to be doing, and what other people do better, and can celebrate that. So there's just a lot less ego, I guess, in one sense, and a lot less need for control.
Sure. Yeah.
I think so. I give some examples in the book, but there's a church in Little Rock, Arkansas, that they started their own, they started their own nonprofit that has all these, like, incubators for all these things, and so they'll release these, and so they're just kind of starting stuff all the time, very entrepreneurial kind of thing. Also having this local congregation, so there's people that will be involved in the nonprofit branch of things, not even recognizing it as part of a church. So so that's within, like, one organization. I know that there's a group of campus ministries now, spearheaded by Crew and Ivy and some others, I think Navigators, like all these ministries are coming together, campus outreach, and saying, hey, there's plenty, instead of fighting for same students, not fighting for, but really, we're still trying to reach the same Christian, right, competing. It's like, there's plenty of campuses that do not have any type of gospel presence.
Yeah. And
so how can we join together for those? And how can we empower students to equip them to be missional extensions on their campuses, And, so I think that there's, instead of trying to do it all, it's recognizing their role in the kingdom in this ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We have about 50 Christian organizations on campus here at UW-Madison.
I bet, that's a big one, right?
Big
10 university.
Yeah, and so variety of different sizes and scopes. Some have landed physical space on campus. We're, I think, the only evangelical one that doesn't. The rest are kind of our mainline friends that are here on campus that have had long-term space. Most of our Catholic Student Center is vibrant and thriving. Newman Center is just great on campus here. Our evangelical parachurch ministries don't usually have landed space. It's been really difficult for us to get people all in the room to do anything collaborative for kind of like as a missional extension across campus. And so that's been really, that's been hard at times, for us to be able to do that. We actually have a lot of long-term senior staff, campus ministry staff here that have been around campus for 15 to 25 years, which is abnormal to most, I think, other campuses. There's a lot of, changing that's happening. How would you think about that group coming together as missional extension and thinking about, okay, where can they their mission can uniquely be formed and executed through the campus, but where are some moments that we should be coming together as, a missional extension without some other churches that are on campus, but very few. I mean, there are very few denominational or non-denominational churches that have, I would say, ministry presence on campus through our community.
So, like you said, so why is it, I want to ask a question first. Why is it hard to get people in the same room?
I think they'll come to the same place. I think that kind of mission of, hey, what could we do as collective that we couldn't do individual? And I don't think, I'm not advocating for, went to my undergrad campus. They actually had their large group meeting all together every single week. So all the different ministries did one large group meeting together. It was like 14,000 students. We'd have over 1,000 students at this large group meeting. I'm not advocating for something like that. I'm advocating for moments or times throughout the academic year where it makes sense for us to say, hey, we actually will have more impact collectively if we do X, Y, and Z together than we will individually on our individual nights in campus, campus buildings or non-campus buildings all across campus here.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if maybe if there's kind of a third way, which is, there's like the individual, your own stuff, you've got your thing, and everybody's, like you said, got their nights that they meet, right? And then you've got okay, let's all join together and do a big worship event. I don't know, whatever kind of thing. What if you have some, what if InterVarsity has the crew staff workers speak at their thing and talk about what God's doing through their part of, and just making other people aware, making students and each other aware that and saying, hey, we're bringing in this person and we want to celebrate what they're doing with their students, kind of thing. And maybe there's a middle level besides the big event type or the big things kind of thing, where it's like, because then you're creating those network connections that I think are going to last more than just the memory of an event or just the memory of the individual thing.
Right.
So I'm wondering maybe some stuff like that. And so it's like, you have the ministry. I'm sure you have the orientation fair, whatever, the new student thing, right? NSO, new student outreach or whatever. Or, and everybody has pizza and everybody has I had students who would be like, my goal is to not have to buy food for the week and I'm going to get a new t-shirt every day. Right. Right. Yeah. And so even like at some of those types of events, what are ways that you can gather, but really more about how can you, cast a vision for a broader ecclesiology and discipleship among all the people involved in each of those individual things, which is good for the kingdom in the long term, besides just impact in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even going saying to these students, hey, you're going to be here for 4 years, probably 4 years, maybe more, maybe less. Also going we don't have to you can recognize this ministry planted, this ministry watered, God provided the growth, this one did the harvest. And so I think that's the other thing, I'm seeing, I have a cousin who's in Young Life staff, and she was in the Netherlands, now she's in France, but very post-Christian Europe. She was in the Bible Belt, and so she said, I could plant a seed and bear fruit in 4 years, and she said, now I'm realizing I may just be the planter and I may never see the fruit. And so part of that also is kind of disabusing ourselves of the notion that we can manufacture some results and being more open-handed with, hey, I'm going to plant, and then they might do this and they might go to this ministry, they might do that. So but explaining that, not just having that internally, but talking about that, and just, we're always discipling our people towards something through our actions, what we're saying and doing. And so how can we be better, each of us, all of us, at discipling people toward more of this understanding of church and our identity as the body, and hey, you're a missional extension, and more than just even the partnership again between the structures. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I'm wondering what you would say to the pastor that's really skeptical of parachurch ministry and seeing that as a potential extension of kind of their work of maybe the embodied local church, like we've talked about. And then also kind of the other side of that. So the parachurch leader who doesn't see maybe the need for their involvement in the local church where they're at. We've talked a lot about campus ministry workers. Let's maybe use that as an example, right? So they're doing ministry, they're on ministry on campus, something, but they don't really see the need. They don't think that there's a need for them to be involved in the local church. They're not volunteering in any capacity. They're just showing up on Sunday, kind of punching their church ticket, leaving. Yeah. What would you say to kind of those two different camps? You have so much leadership experience, and would love to hear kind of how you would maybe redirect those two people.
Yeah. So for the pastor of the church leader, so, well, where is that skepticism coming from? Mm-hmm. And, I think historically, I think you make a case that these missional extensions, I think that's too much of a siloed probably understanding of church. And so it's like, how do we, are there certain things that the church can and must do and only the church can do? Local, yes. Should they be doing it all? No, it's actually hampering, I think, the kingdom, because there's so many things you can't do well, mm-hmm. or can't do, and so throughout history, throughout church history, throughout scripture, we see these, apostolic bands, and that the local church has a role, but is not structured, in a way to be able to do all those things, to be, to, support and resource and recognize all that. Yes. And so recognizing that your campus staff worker who comes to your church, and you go, well, they're only involved in their own ministry. It's like, well, yeah, they are an extension of you. They're an extension for the kingdom. Mm-hmm. They're going in a place that if you try to have just all the students come to your place, they're having conversations that you're never going to be able to have, and so release them to do that. And yeah, they need some resources, and it takes resources away from a local church. It's God's resources. So again, it's like, opening your hands to that kind of thing. And then for the campus staff workers, yeah, you're doing your ministry and stuff out there, but you need to be connected to a local body of, not just your fellow staff workers, but the full diversity of the body, and coming together and gathering for worship and fellowship, and that life on life, stuff, and the formation. And so being an intentional member of that community, mm-hmm. not necessarily just serving for the organization. I think so. If we're reframing, from organizations to these community as well, and the relational dynamic of it, I think that helps mm-hmm. reframe as well from this whole institutional kind of thing. And so it's view yourself as what is the campus missionary's place in a kind of robust ecclesiology. And it's mm-hmm. You are a missional extension, and that's good. And so maybe your role is to help teach, that framework to the body that you're a part of, but be a part of a body for that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Well, I have two last questions for us on our time together here. You talk in the book a little bit about every 500 years, kind of a major church event kind of shift that's happening. Yeah. And we're kind of on the cusp of maybe something that's happening. Be curious on those, these other moments in history. And then what do you see? I mean, as you're looking forward in the future, kind of this shift maybe that we're in right now with the church, how would you maybe define that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so that rummage sale idea comes from, Phyllis Stickle wrote about it in her book called The Great Emergence, and she's actually quoting a Church of England bishop from years ago who talked about every 500 years the church undergoes this great rummage sale where there's all this upheaval. And so the first was 500 Gregory the Great, and then the two that we may know more about, just around 1032, the Great Schism, so kind of Orthodox and Rome kind of broke off, and it was just big upheaval. And then, of course, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, the mm-hmm. Counter-Reformation, and so 1500, 1490, whatever. And so now we're 500 years out, and here we are again, and it seems like we are going through another similar rummage sale where there's established things. The whole establishment seems to be quaking at the foundation, and or some people say attacked or whatever, but people are questioning a lot of things, trying new structures, demolishing old structures, old mindsets, assumptions, those kind of things. And so out of that, it's a very, to use a good educational term, disequilibrating, a lot of disequilibrium, because you're in this earthquake and figuring out, but there's also this so it's can be very frightening because like we don't know where things are going to land. And I would say right now we kind of don't know where things are going to land. I see some trends, but also it's opportunity to start creating and experimenting with new things. And so, the pandemic exposed and accelerated some of these things were already shifting. There are these major cracks, and people were saying, how do we hold it together from cracking? Yeah. And it's like, well, we're past that now. Right. And so what do we do now that, the universe has kind of cracked a bit? And, and so I'm seeing people asking these types of questions. That's why I think, the book, that I wrote came with 7 or 8 years of kind of my own exploration, but really everybody started asking these same things and are saying, okay, a lot of people are saying, what is the church and what are we supposed to be and do? And so I think there is some of it is just a flat out resistance against structure or organization or authority. A lot of that's out of hurt. And so like I'm seeing a lot of deconstruction and more and more reconstruction, or what's the good things and what are we for, not just what are we against. And so I think we need to be people of hope in the middle of this, because this is the gates of hell are not going to prevail against the church. And but I think people are experimenting with a lot of different types of missional extensions, things even blurring even the lines more between what is a church and a missional they're kind of adopting more of that mindset, even though they're not using the language that I suggest in the book, And so we actually have a Doctor of Ministry track at Denver Seminary called New Missional Movements, which is about that. It's like, what are alternate expressions of church and kingdom and mission, besides what has been kind of the dominant models of things. I think there is some still people trying to keep the walls, and so we'll see, like, if there'll still be that, but then there'll also be, then people are digging in their heels, and others are saying, no, we're more open to more collaboration, and maybe, you see more churches that are going back to just the Apostles' Creed, and like the fall of denominationalism or denominations. There's much more, which is kind of an impact of parachurch, like mega church, and stuff. And so it's like there's more non-denom and less of this keeping to these particular structures or names or denominational walls. And so I think a lot of walls are coming down. Yeah. And I think that's good. And where they're all going to land, I don't know. Yeah. So I'm suggesting one thing, this missional extension kind of ecosystem. Yeah.
Well, it's been interesting to see some of the research that Barna's been doing lately around kind of this next generation coming and forming, and kind of the resurgence of them back into spiritual formation and spiritual life. You work with a lot of young leaders who are, all over the map and probably different generations. What's your hope for the kind of this next generation as you see kind of the leaders that are forming and the people that are launching out of the ministries that we're a part of?
That they will, that they will forgive us for our mistakes and think of new ways, instead of just being, I don't know, this is what pops to mind. So I don't know if this is a good example or not, but my generation was like the most divorced generation, like our parents, like latchkey kids, all that kind of stuff. And so there's and a little bit, some folks younger. And so like, they could have said, you know what, I don't believe in marriage. This is a mess. Like what I experienced was awful. But instead they're saying, I'm doing it differently. And so I hope for a generation that says, man, they maybe got off track in these directions or whatever, but like, hey, we're going to do it differently. So that we will stay a people of hope, and that we can convey hope, and that young leaders, I'm seeing tons of hope for the future of the church and for ministry and for mission, and broadly speaking. My kids are 26 and 24, and they're not necessarily caught up in all this angst. They're just saying like, hey, we're just going to do it differently. And why are we all stuck on all this stuff that's been, the defining culture wars and battles and stuff? They're just going like, we're just going to make a difference right here, kind of thing. And so I'm really encouraged by the fresh thinking and the hope and the new things they're doing.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's a great word to end on. Angie, thank you so much for being on the Upwards podcast. We really appreciate your time. And the book is excellent. Beyond the Church and Parachurch, From Competition to Missional Extension. It's InterVarsity Press. run out and grab it. If you're a ministry leader of any kind, or you're interested in this area, this is a really pivotal book that you should have in your library. So Angie, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us.
Thank you, and thanks for encouragement about the book, and thanks for your ministry that you're doing, and as you're being a missional extension right where you are at Madison.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for listening and watching, and go in peace.